Two states can have the exact same median income, and one family can live comfortably while the other can barely make rent. It all depends on one thing: where they live. This is the full picture. Every single state in America, ranked from the most expensive place to live to the cheapest, and what that ranking actually reveals about the country right now in 2026, at a moment when that ranking is shifting faster than it has in years. Before we get into the ranking, it's worth explaining how cost of living is actually measured, because it's not just how expensive is rent. Analysts typically combine 6 categories: housing, utilities, groceries, transportation, healthcare, and general goods and services into a single index number. That number is set against a national average of 100. A state sitting above 100 is more expensive than the national average. A state below 100 is cheaper. It sounds simple, but the gap between the top and bottom of this list is enormous, and it's growing. At the very top of that scale this year, Hawaii sits at a cost of living index of 185. At the very bottom, Oklahoma sits at 86. That means the actual cost of living in Hawaii is more than double what it is in Oklahoma. Same country, same currency, same federal minimum wage in most cases, and a household in one state can be spending twice as much as a household in the other just to cover the exact same basic needs, from the same grocery brands to the same doctor's visit to the same tank of gas. Let's start at the top. Hawaii is the most expensive state in the country to live in, and it's not particularly close. Almost everything consumed on the islands, from lumber to groceries to fuel, has to be shipped in, which adds cost at every single stage before it even reaches a store shelf. Add extremely limited land for housing development, and you get a state where basic living costs are dramatically higher than almost anywhere else in America. Right behind Hawaii is California, which ranks as the most expensive state for cost of living using a broader competitiveness index that also weighs insurance and housing burden. The numbers here are genuinely staggering. Los Angeles has been ranked as the metro area with the highest barrier to home ownership in the entire country, and it's not just coastal metros anymore. Insurance costs, driven partly by wildfire risk, have pushed premiums sharply higher across huge parts of the state in just the past few years, adding a cost burden that didn't even exist at this scale a decade ago. New York rounds out the very top of the list. Manhattan alone has an average home price that crossed $2.9 million in the first quarter of this year. An average apartment rent in the city is closing in on $6,000 a month. To put that in perspective, that's more than many households in the cheapest states spend on housing in an entire year. Rounding out the 10 most expensive states this year, Massachusetts, driven by housing and healthcare costs, concentrated around the Boston metro; Colorado, where average insurance premiums have nearly doubled since 2020; and Florida, where homeowners are increasingly being forced onto the state's insurer of last resort plan as private insurers pull back from high-risk coastal areas entirely. Notice the pattern here. This isn't really a story about wages being too low in these states. In most cases, wages in California, New York, and Massachusetts are actually well above the national average. This is a story about specific structural cost categories: housing scarcity, insurance risk, and healthcare rising so fast that even a good income struggles to keep up. Now let's flip to the other end of the map. The 3 cheapest states to live in this year are West Virginia, Mississippi, and Oklahoma. If you've watched our earlier episodes, 2 of those names should sound very familiar. We already covered why Mississippi and West Virginia have the highest poverty rates in the country. Now, here's the twist those 2 facts create when you put them together. These are also the cheapest states to actually live in. On paper, that sounds like it should balance out. In practice, it doesn't, and understanding why is the most important part of this entire video. A low cost of living only helps a household if their income is high enough to take advantage of it. In West Virginia and Mississippi, wages are also among the lowest in the country, often low enough that the savings from cheaper housing and groceries barely move the needle. A family isn't actually better off if both their income and their expenses are at the bottom of the national scale simultaneously. They're just poor in a cheaper environment, not financially comfortable. It's the difference between a state being affordable and a state simply having less to offer at every price point, including the price of a roof, a doctor's visit, and a decent school. There's a second catch, and it's a serious one. Statistically, there's a strong correlation between the very cheapest states to live in and the most limited access to primary care physicians. The same states offering the lowest sticker price on daily life are frequently the same states where finding a doctor, a specialist, or an open hospital bed is hardest. That's not a coincidence. Lower regional wealth means less healthcare infrastructure gets built and sustained in the first place. So the cheap state label hides a real trade-off that a simple cost index doesn't capture. You might spend less money, but you may also have dramatically less access to the services that money is supposed to buy. Most of the country actually sits in the middle of this range. And that middle is where a slightly different, quieter version of the same problem is playing out. Take Texas. Texas isn't among the cheapest states anymore, and it isn't among the most expensive either, but it's a useful example of a state where the cost of living index number can be misleading on its own. Texas has one of the highest utility cost burdens in this middle tier, partly due to extreme summer heat driving air conditioning costs and a power grid that has faced well-documented strain in recent years. At the same time, Texas has led the nation in raw job growth this year, so you get an unusual mix. Strong employment numbers on one hand and a real rising cost burden on the other, layered right on top of each other in the same state. States like North Dakota and Nebraska show a related pattern from a different angle. Their overall cost index sits close to the national average, but healthcare costs specifically run higher than almost every other category in the index. That's a detail a single overall number can easily hide. A state can look moderately affordable on the surface while still quietly squeezing residents through one specific unavoidable cost, like healthcare or utilities, that a general index averages away. This is really the core lesson of the middle of the map. The overall ranking number is useful, but it's a summary, not the full story. Two states can have nearly identical overall scores for completely different underlying reasons, and those reasons matter enormously if you're the one actually living there and paying the bills. There's one more middle tier trend worth mentioning because it's changed the entire calculation for a growing number of Americans. Remote work. A decade ago, where you lived and where you earned your paycheck were almost always the same decision. That's no longer true for a meaningful share of the workforce. Someone earning a California or New York salary while living in a lower cost state like Tennessee or North Carolina is, in effect, opting out of this ranking entirely, capturing a high cost state income against a mid or low cost state expense base. This has quietly reshaped migration patterns into states like Texas, Tennessee, and the Carolinas over the past several years, and it's part of why some mid-tier states have seen faster population and housing cost growth than their wage data alone would predict. New residents moving in with outside income bid up local housing costs for everyone already living there, even those still earning local wages. It's a small-scale version of the same dynamic playing out in expensive coastal metros, just arriving later and less intensely in these formerly more affordable regions. Here's the part of this story that should concern almost everyone watching, regardless of which state you're in. This gap isn't stable, it's widening. Inflation is currently running at its highest level in roughly 3 years. And it isn't hitting every state or even every cost category evenly. Housing and insurance costs in the already expensive states are compounding faster than wages can keep pace, especially in regions dealing with wildfire risk, hurricane risk, or simple land scarcity. Meanwhile, the cheapest states aren't seeing costs fall to compensate. In many cases, their costs are rising too, just from a lower starting point, while the wage side of their economy stays largely flat. Layer the current labor market on top of this, and the picture gets more complicated still. 2026 has been defined by what many economists are calling forever layoffs. a pattern of continuous rolling job cuts driven heavily by AI adoption and corporate restructuring rather than one single sharp recession. Tens of thousands of workers have already been affected by formal layoff notices filed across dozens of states this year. That kind of employment instability hits hardest in exactly the expensive states where housing and insurance costs leave almost no financial cushion if a paycheck stops for even a month or two. So you end up with a genuinely difficult set of trade-offs facing American households right now. Move to a cheaper state, and you may be trading affordability for weaker healthcare access and lower wages. Stay in an expensive state for the stronger job market, and you're absorbing housing and insurance costs that are rising faster than almost any paycheck can keep up with in a year when that same paycheck is less secure than it's been in a long time. There isn't a clean, universally correct answer to that trade-off. And that's precisely why this data matters so much more than a simple ranking might suggest at first glance. It's not just trivia about which state costs more. It's the actual set of constraints millions of households are weighing right now, often without having all of this information laid out clearly in one place. When you put the entire map together, side by side, a pattern becomes impossible to ignore. It's not simply that some states are rich and some are poor. It's that the entire country has split into two separate and in some ways incompatible cost realities. One America where the jobs and infrastructure exist, but the cost of daily life is climbing out of reach, even for solid earners. And another America where daily life is technically affordable, but the healthcare, the schools, and the economic opportunity to actually build wealth are thin on the ground. Neither side of that split is the American dream working the way it's supposed to. And based on where inflation, insurance costs, and this year's labor market are heading, the gap between these two Americas isn't closing. It's getting wider. We've now covered the poorest states in the country, and today, the most and least expensive ones to actually live in. Next, we're going to look at what happens when those two maps overlap completely. The states where people are simultaneously paying the most and earning the least. That overlap turns out to be one of the more counterintuitive parts of this entire series, and it's not always the states you'd expect. If you want to see that comparison, subscribe, because that episode is coming next.